Hello, my name is Bailey, and I am an AmeriCorps member with the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, and I am going to take you through one of our new virtual pre-recorded field trips. So let's get started. Welcome to our Forest Health virtual field trip. I am going to be talking about the common trees in Tahoe and how to assess forest health here. So normally our field trips are not virtual. You would get to come into the Tahoe Science Center, which is over in Incline Village, Nevada, and you would get a tour of our Science Center to see our exhibits and do a couple of hands-on activities with us. Unfortunately, we are still closed to the public, which is why we are now bringing you these online pre-recorded virtual field trips. So this is the agenda for our forest health field trip. I have it broken up into 3 parts. So if you need to take a break at any time during this video, these are kind of the natural breaking points. So part 1, we're going to start with going over the common trees that are found in Tahoe, and then we're going to practice our tree identification skills. So if you're in the Tahoe area and you're doing this, I highly recommend that you go outside and grab some pine cones or pine needles, or look at photos of trees that you've seen in Tahoe, or if you are somewhere with a window and a view of some trees, you can look out like I can right here. So if you see me look to the side, I'm looking at trees out my window. Part 2 is factors that contribute to forest health. What is biodiversity? What's affecting Tahoe's forests? And how to identify a healthy forest. And then our last part, we'll start off with, I'm going to go outside for a nature walk and we're going to collect some data to assess forest health. And then we'll have a discussion about it and talk about whether or not Tahoe's forests are healthy or unhealthy. Then we'll end the field trip by watching a quick video on what our UC Davis Turk researchers are doing to make Tahoe's forests resilient. And I will go over the follow-up activities after you get through this presentation. So we are going to start this field trip with a warm-up that I like. It's called I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of. And we do this so that we can warm up our brains thinking about the different subjects that we're going to be going over in this field trip. And it's done in this format so that you can start thinking about trees and forests the way that a scientist would. So I'm going to have you make some observations, ask some questions, and make connections. We are going to start off this warm-up by making some observations. So I want you to think about trees you see every day in Tahoe. And you can either visualize this in your mind, you can go based off of the photo that I have provided right here that I took in one of the many forests that surrounds Lake Tahoe. You can look out a window if you have one and look out at some trees. And I want you to make observations with the phrase, I notice. So I notice blank about trees in Tahoe. And throughout the field trip, there are these blue pause slides, and this indicates that I want you to pause for the time that's indicated here at the bottom. So in this one, you would pause it for about 1 minute. And if it's possible, I want you to have a discussion with anybody that is participating in this field trip with you. So if you have siblings or your parents or friends that are sitting at home, you can discuss during these pause here sections. If you're by yourself, that's totally okay. I want you to then get a notebook or a piece of paper and write down your observations or your questions or the discussion questions that we ask. So you can pause the video now and for 1 minute, make some observations about what you notice about trees in Tahoe. So I hope that was enough time for you to come up with some things that you notice. I will quickly share a couple things that I notice about trees in Tahoe. So I noticed that when you're driving down the road in Tahoe, you never just see one tree by itself. You always see a bunch of trees. And I noticed that we live in a forest, which is an area with a lot of trees. Um, I also noticed that the trees in Tahoe are very, very tall. So you can see in this photo here, this is the subway in Kings Beach, and you can see how much taller these trees are that surround our subway. So those are just a few things that I have observed or noticed, and I'm sure that there are many, many more observations that you can make. But we're going to move on to questions. So I want you to do the same thing, discuss with anybody that's with you, or write down what you wonder about trees in Tahoe. So I want you to pause and take 1 minute to talk about what you wonder. Some of the things that I notice about trees in Tahoe is, why do they all look very similar? So they all are very, very tall, they all are very green, and they have similar shapes. So I wonder, why do all of our trees in Tahoe look very similar? And then last section is our connections. So I want you to make some connections using the phrase, the words healthy forest remind me of. So again, you have 1 minute to discuss or write down what the words healthy forest remind you of. So when I think about the words healthy forest, the word healthy makes me think about people and what I feel when I'm healthy. So I know that I feel healthier when I'm drinking a lot of water, when I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, or when I get outside and I exercise more. That's when I feel healthy. And I can make some connections to a healthy forest based on how I feel when I'm healthy. So a tree in a forest can't get out and get exercise, but trees need water. Just like me, they need nutrients and sunlight. So there's some similar connections that I can make between how I feel when I'm healthy and what a healthy forest might be like. So in a second, I'm going to pass this on to Heather, who's going to take you on a tour of one of my favorite exhibits in the Tahoe Science Center, which is our Trees of Tahoe exhibit. So she is going to go through the 8 most common tree species in Tahoe and how you can identify them. And while she's talking about these different trees, I want you to see if you can figure out what trees you have outside based on the traits that she tells you about. So if you were able to bring in pine cones or pine needles, or if you can see any trees from where you're at, see if you can figure out what those are based on the information that Heather gives you. So I'm going to pass it over to Heather now.
Hi, I'm Heather with the UC Davis Tahoe Science Center, and I want to welcome you to our virtual science tour. Today we're going to talk about the trees of Tahoe, and I want to share with you the 8 most common trees of Lake Tahoe. Okay, so this is the sugar pine. This is the tallest of Tahoe's trees. It can be almost 200 feet tall, and it has the largest cone. You can see a couple sizes of the cones, but it does get to these quite large cones. The branches are hard to reach because the lower branches fall off of the tree, but I had found a baby sugar pine, and the thing about the sugar pines is when you see them, they look quite a bit feathery and soft, because where most pine trees have 2 or 3 needles per cluster, a sugar pine has 5, and so you can see the 5 needles. And sugar also has 5 letters, and that's an easy way to remember it. This pine is one of the more common pines now, and this is the lodgepole pine, and I can really recognize it by its bark. The bark looks like cornflakes in a way, and the branches are not as feathery as the sugar pine, and when I grab the needles, they come off in 2, and the way I remember lodgepole pine is those 2 needles make an L for lodgepole. And the lodgepole pine has these cute little cones, and those cones can also be attached right on the branch. And so you'll see the cones attached right on there. The next 2 pines of Tahoe are the ponderosa pine and the Jeffrey pine. And the branches look incredibly similar. They'd be impossible to tell apart if you just had a branch. And the way you can tell that it is either a Jeffrey or a ponderosa is because it has 3 needles, and they both have that long 3 needles. That one's a little bent, but you get the idea, and they're all connected together. The pine cones are a little bit different. The ponderosa pine is slightly smaller than the Jeffrey pine cone. Not always, because you can also have smaller Jeffrey cones. But the real way is that the Jeffrey pine cone, the prickers poke in a little bit. So this is a gentle cone. I can put my hands on it without getting stuck on it. This one, you have to be really careful because these poke out. And so we say prickly ponderosa and gentle Jeffrey. The other thing that's representative of a ponderosa pine is that the bark, if you were to break off a piece of the bark, it breaks apart and looks like these little puzzle pieces. So I think of prickly ponderosa and puzzle ponderosa, whereas the Jeffrey, with its gentle cones, this bark is a little bit darker, and if you get your nose in the tree, you can smell a delicious vanilla or butterscotch smell. And so the gentle Jeffrey has that delicious smell. Okay, the next two trees we're going to talk about are both fir trees. And fir trees have much shorter needles. You can see that they're just about an inch or so long. And the two main firs that we have are white fir, and you see that it's flat with short needles, versus the red fir, which looks a little bit more like a toothbrush. They point up. And so these needles are short, and that's how we know that they're fir. One thing that's tricky about a young white fir is that they can sometimes start pointing up a little bit. So if you're looking at brand new growth, it can be confusing, but the main way to tell the difference is that white fir grows near lake level and red fir grows up at higher elevations. So another way to tell the difference between the white fir and the red fir is that the red fir is round and they go around the branch, where the white fir is wide. So red for round and white for wide. This beautiful tree is a cedar tree, and it is very easy to recognize because of its flat, fern-like leaves and its smooth cinnamon red bark. And the bark is very obvious when you see it because it's so red and it has this very unique and distinct look to it that makes it a cedar. Okay, last but not least, this is a quaking aspen. And right now the leaves are green, but in the fall these leaves will turn yellow and fall off. This is our most common deciduous tree, so it loses its leaves for the winter. So this would be a great plant to put on the south side of your building because it would provide shade for you in the summer, but wouldn't prevent the sun from coming in the winter. And it is a quaking aspen. Thanks for joining us at the UC Davis Tahoe Science Center. We hope you'll come visit soon.
I am out here in the forest near Tahoe City, and I'm going to put your knowledge to the test by asking you to help me identify some of the trees out here in the forest. We're going to start here with this baby tree. It's not a full-grown tree, but because it's so small, I can actually get a really close-up look at these needles. And so I'm going to take some needles off this tree, and we can see that the needles came off attached together, and they are attached in a bundle of 3. So what tree do you think this baby tree is? You can pause the video until you have your answer. So we know that this tree is a pine tree because its needles are attached together in a bundle. They were not attached individually. And we know that it is either a ponderosa pine or a Jeffrey pine because it has needles attached in a bundle of 3. Here is our next tree. This one's also a younger tree. It's not fully grown, but it's a little bit older than the last one that we were looking at. So we can take a close-up look at these needles. What tree do you think that this is? The needles are flat, they're pretty scaly, and they are also segmented. I can break off individual pieces of these needles. So pause the video until you have your answer, and then resume the video when you're ready. And this is actually a cedar tree. You can see it's kind of well hidden, but it's got that really red bark, which also tells us that this is a cedar. Here is a really good example of two mature, fully grown cedar trees. So they have that long vertical stripped bark, and their needles are a little too high for me to touch, which is why we were looking at the younger sapling. And right at the base of these two cedars is an unknown tree, one that we haven't covered yet. So we can take a closer look at these needles, and we can see how they are attached to the branch. If I take one needle off, it comes off individually. This was not attached in a bundle. This needle was attached directly to the branch here. So what tree do you think this is? You can pause the video until you have your answer, and then hit resume when you are ready for me to tell you. So this is a fir tree, and firs are different from pines because their needles are attached directly to the branch. They are not attached in bundles. And this is a fir sapling. It's still pretty small. This tree is a little bit trickier because we are just coming out of winter, so it doesn't have any leaves on it to help us identify this tree. It is one of our deciduous trees here. It's got white bark, and it's also known for having these little eye-like shapes on the tree. This tree's a little bit trickier, so I want you to take a few seconds and pause the video, and once you think you know what it is, you can hit play. So this is our quaking aspen tree. And I will add some photos to show what this looks like in the spring and summertime when it has green leaves, and what it looks like in the fall when its leaves turn orange before they fall off in the winter, which is what is happening right now. Thank you for practicing your tree identification skills with me. Before we move on, I want to go over how to identify the different types of pine and fir trees that we have in our forests. We only have one species of cedar and aspen, and we already discussed how to identify those two trees, so we're just going to focus on our pines and our firs. In Tahoe, we have four that are most commonly found, which are the sugar pine, lodgepole pine, Jeffrey pine, and ponderosa pine. And there are a few different ways that you can tell the difference between these trees, which I'll go through. So the sugar pine is most easily identified by its very large pine cones that can grow to over 20 centimeters. So these pine cones can get to longer than a foot, and they're very easy to recognize, whether the pine cones are still in the tree or if they are on the ground by the base of the tree. It's pretty hard to miss these gigantic pine cones. So that is our sugar pine. Our lodgepole pine is most easily identified by its unique bark, which resembles cornflakes. So if you see any pine tree in Tahoe and you can't figure out what it is, and its bark has this cornflake look, that's how you know that it is a lodgepole pine. The Jeffrey pine and ponderosa pine are very similar trees. They can be kind of hard to determine the difference between the two because their needles are the same length and have the same number of needles per bundle, which we'll talk about in just a second. But there are two other ways that you can determine the difference between a Jeffrey pine and a ponderosa pine, and that is by looking at their bark and their pine cones. So the Jeffrey pine, if you are walking through a forest and you don't know what type of tree it is and you're feeling adventurous, you can actually stick your nose into the bark of a tree, and if it produces a really sweet smell, it can be vanilla or butterscotch or cinnamon scented, that's how you know it is a Jeffrey pine. They smell really good, whereas all of the other pine trees' bark do not produce that sweet scent. And the ponderosa pine, if you walk up to it and you smell it and it does not produce a sweet scent, and you actually can peel off some of the bark and it comes off in what we like to say is it looks like puzzle pieces, that's representative of a ponderosa pine tree. It's got puzzle piece bark for the ponderosa pine. The other way that you can determine the difference between the pine trees is by looking at their bark or their needles. So the sugar pine, we talked about how they have the largest pine cones. They also have 5 needles per bundle. And the way that we like to remember this is that the word sugar has 5 letters in it, and sugar pines have 5 needles per bundle. The lodgepole pines have the smallest pine cones out of our 4 pine trees, and they only have 2 needles per bundle. And you can remember this because when you open up the needles and you push them into a 90-degree angle, it makes an L for lodgepole. Our Jeffrey pine and our ponderosa pine, again, they are difficult to tell the difference between the two because they both have 3 needles per bundle, and those 3 needles are of very similar length. So you have to either smell their bark and look at their bark, or if you can't tell by their bark, you have to look for their pine cones. So if you pick up a pine cone and you can put your hands around it and it does not poke you, that means it is a gentle Jeffrey cone. And the reason for that is the spines, which stick out at the end of every piece on a pine cone, those spines face inwards on a gentle Jeffrey cone, so they do not poke you. But on a prickly ponderosa pine cone, those spines face outwards, so when you go to pick it up, it will immediately poke you. So you can tell the difference because of a gentle Jeffrey or a prickly ponderosa. Those are the 4 types of pine trees that we commonly see in our forests, but now we're going to go over the 2 types of fir trees and how to tell the difference between them. And that is white fir or red fir. And there are 2 main ways that you can determine what type of fir it is. You can look at the layout of their needles or the location of the tree itself. So white fir are generally found around lake level or lower elevation, whereas red fir are found at higher elevations. So if you're on a hike up further into the mountains, you'll be more likely to spot a red fir than you will be if you are on a beach near the lake. The other way is the orientation of the needles on a fir tree. So our white fir trees have needles that face out on the sides, and our red fir trees have needles that face all different directions around the branch. So the way that I like to remember this is that if the needles are out wide, it's for a white fir, and if the needles are round the branch, then it's for red fir. So now I want you to share what trees you have around or near your house. And this is when I want you to look closer at the pine cones or pine needles or the tree in your yard. Um, so I want you to pause this video here and you can discuss with your friends or family that you're doing this with what type of tree you have and why. And if you are by yourself, this is when I want you to take some notes on why you think your pine cone comes from one tree or why your needles resemble a specific tree. So pause here for 5 minutes. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the importance of tree identification. So why did I just make you learn all of that? There was a reason beyond just me giving you information about the common trees found in Lake Tahoe. So again, I want you to pause the video here and discuss or write down why you think it's important to correctly identify trees. So the importance of tree identification. Why is it important to be able to correctly identify trees? I personally am a huge tree nerd. I love to be able to go on hikes through the forest and know what's around me. It gives me a better sense of the environment. I feel a little bit more connected to nature when I know what's happening. So if I can point out a tree and I know that it is a Jeffrey pine and I know that I can go up and smell it and it's going to smell like cinnamon. I personally just like knowing those facts and I like to impress my friends with those facts. But there is a research purpose for tree identification, and that is being able to identify what trees are in our forest gives us a way to determine whether or not our forest is healthy. So this takes us back to the title of this virtual field trip, which is Forest Health. So we are going to eventually use our tree identification skills to assess whether or not the forests here in Tahoe are considered healthy. But before we can do all of that, we kind of have to learn how knowing what trees are around us relate to forest health, and if there are any other factors that relate to forest health. So before we get too far into this, if you feel like you need to take a break and step away from your computer, that's totally fine. You can just pause the video and come back. Otherwise, we're going to dive right into forest health. So, what are factors of a healthy forest? I am going to take a closer look at each one of these factors in just a minute, but for right now, I'm just going to go through them pretty briefly. So, the majority of trees and plants are alive. There's a diversity of age groups. There are other types of life in the forest, and a diversity of species. So the majority of trees and plants are alive. This one might seem like an obvious factor because if we're thinking about forest health, it's probably not a very healthy forest if your trees and plants are dead, but we want to highlight the word majority here. So it's okay to have a couple of dead trees. That's totally normal. All trees at some point will die. So it's a completely normal part of forest ecosystem to have some dead trees, as long as the majority of them are alive. So I want you to take a close look at these two photos and think about which one do you think shows a healthier forest, photo number 1 or photo number 2. And I will give you about 20 seconds to take a look. You can write down some observations, or you can talk about them with your friends or family who is participating in this field trip. And I will start our 20-second timer. Okay, our 20 seconds is up. And we're going to do these type of questions throughout the next couple of slides when we're focusing on our factors of healthy forest. So I want you to think critically when you're looking at photos in comparison and trying to figure out which one you think is healthier, and really keep the factors that we talk about in mind here. So we've only talked about the majority of trees and plants being alive, and in these two photos, photo number 1 would show the healthier forest because it shows the majority of trees and plants are alive. So in photo number 1, we have lots of trees that still have their branches filled with needles and leaves. They're very green, and it shows a lush, healthier forest. Looks like in the background, there's a couple of dead trees that we can see because they're very bare. They don't have their needles. They're this kind of light brown color. But in photo number 2, all of these light brown trees represent dead trees. So some of them are missing their needles and leaves, and some of them might still have their needles and leaves, but they've turned brown. So if you see an all brown tree, that's also an indicator of a dead tree, even if it still has its needles. But the majority of the trees in the forest in photo number 2 are dead. So just based on that one factor that we were just talking about, I would say that photo number 1 shows a healthier forest here. So a variety of age groups is another factor that influences forest health. So we have 4 different age groups that we can classify a tree based on. So the first one is our seedlings, and that's what these two photos represent. And seedlings are new growth of trees. They're coming right out of the forest floor, and they are not very tall. A seedling is anywhere between a couple of inches to 3 feet tall. A sapling is the next age group, and that is a tree that is over 3 feet tall, but it's not quite mature yet. And so if you see a tall sapling, one that's taller than you, and you're trying to determine whether or not it's a sapling or a mature tree, the best way that you can determine this is actually by pushing on the bark, because saplings have flexible bark. So if you push on it and you can move the tree, that's how you know it's a sapling. But if I were to go and push on a mature tree, it's big, it's grown, it's got very stiff bark, and I'm not going to be able to move it. So that's what separates our saplings and mature trees. Mature trees are a little bit easier to determine their age group. It's what we generally think of when we're thinking of trees in Tahoe, as we're thinking about these giant pines and firs and cedars that are a couple hundred feet tall. They've got really big trunks, so I can go up and hug one and my hands would not meet around the tree. And mature trees produce cones because cones is how they distribute their seeds, so it's how they reproduce. And that's what makes that a mature tree. And our last age group are dead trees. And dead trees can take on a couple of different looks, but the main way that we can identify dead trees is that they are either entirely brown, so their needles are no longer green or their leaves are no longer green. They've turned brown because they've stopped being able to photosynthesize, or they don't have needles and leaves at all. They're completely bare, which is what we're seeing in this photo here of dead trees. So they don't have any branches or leaves or needles left on them. These trees in particular in this photo are blackened from wildfire that came through and killed all of these trees. So those are just a couple of different ways that you can identify dead trees. The reason why a variety of age groups is vital to forest health has to do with reproduction, competition for resources, and ensuring forest resiliency. So if you're looking at a forest that has just mature trees and you're walking through, you're taking a hike and you don't see any seedlings, you don't see any saplings, and you don't see any dead trees, it's just mature trees. While this might look like a healthy forest because it's what we typically imagine in our minds when we think of a forest, it shows that the forest is not reproducing. So when trees drop their cones, that's how they distribute their seeds to grow a seedling, which will then grow into a sapling and then a mature tree. So if we have a forest that's composed of just mature trees, 200 years from now, that forest may not exist because it wasn't reproducing and there are no new trees to take their places once they die. So it's really important that we have a variety of age groups that we need to be seeing all different types of ages within a forest. Okay, here is our second question for which forest do you think is healthier? We're going to be comparing the photos included on this slide. So do you think that photo number 1 shows a healthier forest or photo number 2 shows a healthier forest? And remember, we want to keep our factors of a healthy forest that we've discussed in mind. So we want to think about the variety of age groups that are shown here and also the amount of trees that are dead versus alive. So again, I will give you 20 seconds to make some observations, write them down, or have a discussion about them. Okay, our 20 seconds are up. So in photo number 1, it looks like most of our trees are alive. We maybe have one dead tree right here because it doesn't have any needles or leaves on its branch. And in photo number 2, it looks like, again, most of the trees and plants are alive as well. We don't see any dead trees. So it's not the factor that we are focusing on to try and determine which forest is healthier. So then we're going to think about our variety of age groups. And in photo number 1 for this forest, it looks like most of the trees are mature trees. So I don't see a very high diversity of age groups in photo number 1. Looks like there might be one sapling down here if you look closely enough, but the majority of them are all mature trees. When we look at photo number 2, we can see quite a few seedlings and saplings here in the beginning or in the foreground of the photo. And in the background, we see more mature trees. So I would say based on just what we can see in these two photos, that photo number 2 shows a healthier forest because it has a higher diversity of age groups. Now that doesn't mean that in reality, forest number 2 is actually healthier. We kind of have to make an assumption about it because all we can see is one snapshot that this photo gives us. So just keep in mind that we're only getting to see one part of this forest, and maybe if whoever took the photo here turned and panned to the left or panned to the right, we would see other factors that would tell us if the forest is in fact healthy or unhealthy. But I would say the answer to this question is that photo number 2 represents a healthier forest. So our next factor that influences forest health is other types of life that live in the forest. So what other types of life have you seen in the forest? Here in Tahoe, I have seen plenty of black bears. We got lots of birds. I saw a bald eagle yesterday, which was pretty cool. Those are all different types of animals that live in our forest. We also see plenty of plants and fungi as well here in Tahoe. And so on this slide, I just have a couple of examples of some Tahoe flora, fauna, and fungi. So on the left, we have examples of Tahoe's flora, which is different types of plants that we see in the forest. So you can see this red plant right here is a snow plant. They're very unique because they are bright red rather than traditional green that we associate plants with. Below that, we have our manzanita bush. It's our most common bush or shrub that we find in the understory of our forests here in Tahoe. It's called the greenleaf manzanita. And then in the middle, we have our fauna or our animals. So these are the two different examples that I just gave. So we can see a bald eagle here perched up on the top of a pine tree. And we also have black bears. Looks like this one's walking through a stream somewhere around the lake. And over on our right, we have some examples of different fungi, which is like mushrooms, fungus. So this one is a fruiting body of a mushroom growing up out of the forest floor. And then this is an example of fungi growing off the side of a tree. And the reason why this is an important factor is because other types of life is an indicator of a healthy forest. If you're walking through a forest and you hear lots of birds chirping, you can see some different plant life growing on the forest floor or some mushrooms. It's an indicator that this is a healthy forest. Whereas if you are walking through a forest and you don't hear any of the birds, you don't see any other type of life, it's an indication that something's happening in this forest that doesn't allow it to sustain other types of life, and that is not healthy. And the last factor that we're going to talk about for forest health is a diversity of species, which is also called biodiversity. And this is an extremely important topic that we're going to spend a little bit more time on than some of the other ones. So I want you to pause the video here, and in the PDF that follows along this virtual field trip, under Explain, there should be a link to a YouTube video called What is Biodiversity? And I just want you to watch the first minute and 45 seconds of that video, and it will do a good job of explaining what biodiversity is and why it is important. So you can pause the video now and go watch it, and then once you are done, come back over and resume this presentation. Okay, I hope that helped kind of visualize what is biodiversity and why it matters. And I really like that video because it does a really good job of explaining the difference between high and low biodiversity, but with animals in a forest or in an ecosystem. Now I'm going to model why that's important for forest ecosystems, so just tree species rather than animal species. So in this model, I have our 4 common types of trees found in Tahoe. So these green trees right here, these represent fir trees. The yellow ones represent aspens. The black ones represent pine, and the darker green represents cedars. On the left side of my screen, I have a model of a low biodiversity forest. So there is only one tree species here, and that is fir. And on the right side of my screen, I have a model of a high biodiversity forest that has all 4 different tree species. So we've got aspen, fir, cedar, and pine. So now we're going to introduce the fir engraver beetle to both of these forests. And fir engraver beetles are a type of bark beetle which burrow into the bark of evergreen trees, and they actually eat the softer tissue that's under the bark of the tree. And it eats the softer tissue until the tree dies, and then they move on to the next tree. And fir engraver beetles, as you might be able to guess based on their name, they specifically target fir trees. So we see that the fir engraver beetle has now attached itself onto all of the fir trees in both forests. So what do you think is going to happen next? The fir engraver beetles are latched onto those fir trees. They are burrowing into the bark, and they are eating the softer tissue underneath. And after they have eaten the soft tissue, they kill the tree and they move on to the next one until there are no fir trees left. So that's what we see has happened here in both of our forests. But our low biodiversity forest doesn't have any trees left because it was a fir forest, whereas our high biodiversity forest only lost 2 trees in total. It still has 3 species of trees left over, which makes it more resilient in the long run when faced with a population of bark beetles infesting the forest. And the reason why this example is so important is because fir engraver beetles are not the only type of beetle found in Tahoe's forests. So bark beetles are a general term for beetles that infest trees. They burrow into their bark and eat it until the tree dies and move on. And we have 3 types of bark beetle found in Lake Tahoe. We have the mountain pine beetle, the Jeffrey pine beetle, and the fir engraver beetle. And these are all things that threaten Tahoe's forests. So you can imagine what it would be like if we only had one type of tree here, so we had a low biodiversity forest, how easily a population of just one of these types of bark beetles could come in and decimate the forest, which is why it's really important to promote high biodiversity in our forests here in Lake Tahoe. But that being said, just because we have these bark beetles, it's pretty obvious that we still have a forest. If you go outside, the bark beetles have not taken over our trees yet. There are still trees out there. And that's because these trees actually have a really effective mechanism for dealing with bark beetles. So it's called pitching out, and trees will use their sap or their pitch to push the bark beetle out of the tree. So you can see in this photo, this is a bark beetle that's getting stuck in the sap or the pitch from the tree, and the tree has effectively pushed it out and gotten rid of the beetle. So trees do have mechanisms for dealing with what we call stressors. So they stress the tree out. They have a way of dealing with that. The issue comes from the fact that there are a variety of stressors that our trees in Tahoe have to deal with. So it's not just bark beetles, it's also drought, wildfire, other types of parasites, which bark beetles are considered a type of parasite, fungal pathogens, and then things like competition for space and resources from other trees in the forest. So, like I just said, we still have a forest out there. Our trees are good at dealing with stressful situations. It's just when you get a variety of these stressors that can cause tree mortality. I want to talk a little bit about wildfire because it's a very important part of forest ecosystems. So, is it healthy or unhealthy? And the answer is simply that it is both. Forest fires are a natural part of the forest ecosystem. There are some forests that actually rely on forest fires in order to reproduce. So when a forest fire comes through, it will actually burn the cones and release the seeds into the forest floor. And then that's how you get your new baby trees, our seedlings and our saplings. Um, and fire also burns up fuel in the form of vegetation, plant debris, and dead trees. And when it burns up those fuels, it actually recycles the nutrients from that old vegetation and puts it back into the soil to promote new growth. So that is what we're seeing happening in these 2 photos on this slide. So you can look at the trees in the background and see that they are blackened from wildfire. So wildfire has come through somewhat recently, but on the forest floor, we have lots of new growth. We can see wildflowers and some seedlings all on the floor of the forest after a wildfire has come through. So it is a healthy and natural part of a forest ecosystem. However, there are unhealthy wildfires. So mega wildfires, which are those really, really big, hot, intense wildfires, have become more common in the last few decades. And this is due to 2 main factors, which is climate change and the way that we're managing our forests. So increasing temperatures and droughts that are caused by climate change are leading to those more intense wildfires. And those wildfires are burning hotter, faster, and longer. They're burning up more of our forests than is natural. But the way that we manage our forests do have a very large impact on the severity of wildfires. The way that we have managed our forests has changed over time, and that has had a direct impact on the severity of wildfires. The way that the forests in the US used to be managed before it was colonized by European settlers was that indigenous people had prescribed burns, which was where they would intentionally set fire to different parts of the understory of a forest in order to promote that new growth and recycle nutrients back into the soil. However, when colonizers took over and took away the rights to the land from indigenous people, they also outlawed these burns, and they changed to a new federal policy of fire suppression, which is where there were no more indigenous burns happening. There were no more sections of the forest that were being intentionally burned to promote that new growth, and instead the second a wildfire or a forest fire naturally started or accidentally started, they would try to put it out. So that's what the fire suppression policy meant. And at the time, they thought that this was the way to save the forests. You know, we didn't want our forests to burn down. So if a wildfire starts, you put it out. However, as we just discussed, wildfire is an essential part of a forest ecosystem. So it kind of changed the way that our forests were growing. And instead of a wildfire coming through and burning up those vegetations, recycling nutrients into the ground, and burning the cones in order for trees to reproduce, they started growing in a different way. They didn't have anything to burn up all that vegetation, so it remained on the forest floor. The forests became a little bit more dense with trees because those trees weren't being naturally killed by wildfires, and instead the forests grew very dense. So we can actually see the difference in these two forest management strategies in these photos that I have on this slide. So first we'll take a look at what happens as a result of a fire suppression policy. So this first photo shows us a forest that has been managed using the fire suppression policy. So no intentional burns have been set here. We can see that there's lots of vegetation on the forest floor and that the forest is very dense. And when a wildfire comes through, and again, wildfires are natural, they do happen either by a lightning storm striking one of the trees and starting a wildfire, or by accidents due to somebody starting a campfire and it getting out of control. So here we see that a wildfire has started. Since there's so much vegetation and fuels that were built up over time, this forest fire is burning very hot. So we see that the forest fire is climbing up the trees because it's packed so densely that it can actually hop from tree to tree. And after this fire moves through the forest, it leaves behind basically husks of trees. There's not much of a forest left after a fire has come through a fire suppressed forest. However, we can see a different strategy. So this is on this slide, it's called an ecologically managed forest. And the ecological management has actually come from indigenous culture. So we've used their wisdom. This forest has had prescribed burns set intentionally so that there isn't as much vegetation on the floor of the forest. And another part of this forest management strategy is also to thin the forest. So forest managers will go in and they will cut down certain trees in order to make the forest less dense. And that way, when a wildfire comes through, whether it happened naturally, caused by a human, or it was intentionally set by a human, it burns very low. So it's not a very intense fire. It's burning up the vegetation that is on the forest floor, but it's not climbing the trees and it's not hopping tree to tree. And after a forest fire like this, we see that the majority of our forest is still here. So it hasn't burned down those mature trees, which are actually more likely to survive a fire because of its thick, more fire-resistant bark. So we can see just in these two illustrations how a fire-suppressed forest does not lead to a very healthy forest in the long run in comparison to an ecologically managed forest. So in the last couple of years, within the last decade, California has switched to more of these ecologically managed forest policies in an effort to try and reduce the mega wildfires that we see every fire season on the West Coast. And this photo is just an example of what it looks like when the Forest Service goes out and does a prescribed burn. So they're intentionally burning sections of the forest floor to recycle those nutrients. and hope with the intention that if a wildfire does come through the area, it won't be as severe. So this is why proper forest management is important for maintaining a healthy forest in the long run. Okay, so it is time to test your knowledge again, and we are going to do another quiz that has the same format as the last few questions that I asked during the factors of a healthy forest. So I'm going to show you two photos of different forests, and I want you to take about 30 seconds to make some observations based on the four factors of forest health that we talked about and try and determine which one is healthier. So again, those four factors were that the majority of trees and plants are alive, that there's a variety of age groups in the forest, that there are other types of life in the forest, so our plants, animals, and fungi, and also that there is a high biodiversity, so a variety of different tree species. So I want you to really keep those four factors in mind when you're looking at these photos, and I want you to write down some observations or have a discussion with whoever you are doing this field trip with. And again, remember, we're only getting a snapshot of these forests, so we are making an assumption that what we're seeing is true for the entire forest. So here is our first question, and I am going to set my 30-second timer. Make sure that you are making some observations, and then I will have a discussion about which one I think is healthier. So I'm setting my 30-second timer. Okay, our 30 seconds is up. And the main observation that I made when I was looking at these two photos is the difference in color of the trees shown. So in photo number one, we see that the trees are either brown or green. And if we recall back from the first two factors of a healthy forest are different types of age groups, that dead trees are the ones that are brown, either because their needles and leaves have fallen off, and so we're just looking at bare branches, or because the needles and leaves are still intact, but they're no longer photosynthesizing, they're no longer alive, and so they are kind of this rich brown color. And that's what we're seeing in photo number one. And I would say that at least 50% of the trees are brown dead trees. But in photo number two, we do have a couple of brown trees, especially right in the center here. I'd say we have 2 or 3 dead trees, but the rest are all alive. So based on our first factor of healthy forest, which is the majority of trees and plants are alive, I would say that photo number two shows a healthier forest. And again, we're just comparing the two photos of these forests. This doesn't mean that photo number one shows an unhealthy forest. It just means that based on what we can see, photo number two shows a healthier forest. Okay, here is our second question. I will again start our 30-second timer. And I want you to write down your observations or have a discussion about which one you think is healthier and what factor of a healthy forest you are basing that guess on. Okay, our 30 seconds is up. When I was first looking at these two photos, my mind immediately went to the different types of forest management that we talked about with wildfire. So it wasn't necessarily one of our 4 factors of healthy forest that we talked about at the start of our forest health section, but it is still a very important factor to consider. So in photo number one, we see a very densely packed forest. There's lots of debris on the ground, so vegetation, fallen trees, branches, Looks like maybe here we do have a seedling, potentially just a branch that's fallen. It's kind of hard to tell in the photo. We don't actually see a whole lot of green though, so it's kind of hard to tell how many of these trees are dead or alive based on the angle that this photo was taken at. In photo number 2, the first thing that I noticed is that there is a forest fire happening here. It's hard to tell if this forest fire was set intentionally by the people in this photo or if it is a wildfire that is actually trying to be put out by the people in this photo. So again, we don't have a whole lot of context. We do have to make some assumptions, but some of the other observations that I made is that the wildfire is burning very low. We don't see it climbing up the trees. And we do see that the trees are more widely spaced out. So, based on just the observations that I can make and some of the assumptions that I have to make, I would say that photo number 2 represents a healthier forest than photo number 1, because photo number 2 reminds me of the images that we saw for the ecologically managed forests. Whereas photo number 1 reminds me of the photos that we saw for the fire suppression forest. So, if a wildfire were to come through the forest that we're looking at in this photo, it would most likely burn very hot and very fast because there are a lot of fuels on the ground to fuel that wildfire. Whereas over here, we can see that there is a wildfire happening, but it's not very severe. It's very low intensity, low to the ground, and not climbing up the trees. So when I was looking at these photos, those are the main observations that I took away. So based on that, I would say that photo number 2 is the healthier forest based on the way that it has been managed. So here's that illustration again, just so that we can make a direct comparison. We see our fire suppressed forest here is very densely packed on the forest floor, which is what this photo reminded me of based on the observations that I made. Whereas an ecologically managed forest, we see that the forest fire is really low to the ground. It's not climbing up those trees, it's just on the forest floor, which is what we're seeing in photo number 2. So those are the observations and connections that I made between those two photos and what I know about the different ways that we can manage a forest. Okay, here is our third question. So which one do you think shows a healthier forest? I'll start a 30-second timer so that you have some time to make some observations, make some connections, and draw some conclusions. Okay, our 30 seconds is up. So when I first looked at these two photos, the factor that my mind went to right away was the diversity of age groups and diversity of species. So in photo number 1, we can see that it is the same tree planted across this entire forest. So this is a very low biodiversity forest. These all look exactly the same. And they also look like they're all exactly the same height. There's no diversity in the height or the age group, and there's no diversity in the species. So I would say that photo number 1 shows a very low age diversity and a low biodiversity. Whereas in photo number 2, all of these trees look a little bit different. Some of them have a really bright green, some are more muted green, some are really light. We can see some more branches exposed on some trees than others. Um, and even though these are not the trees that we have talked about, these are not trees native to Tahoe forests or really any forests in California or the US, we can still make the observations that these trees all look the same and these trees look very different. And the reason why I included trees that we don't typically see here in the Tahoe area and a Tahoe forest health field trip is because all of the principles and factors that I've been talking about during this field trip can apply to forests all around the world. These factors are not specific to Tahoe forests. So if we know that photo number 1 shows low biodiversity and low age diversity, And photo number 2 shows high biodiversity. The age diversity can be very challenging, especially from this top-down view. It's kind of hard. We can't see the forest floor at all. We don't know if there's seedlings or saplings or any younger diversity in photo number 2, but we can see that it has a high biodiversity based on the different types of trees that we're seeing here and the different colors and the different shapes. We can make the assumption that photo number 2 shows a healthier forest than photo number 1. And that's just based on observations that we can make about size and coloring and shape, even if we don't know these types of trees. But some background on these photos, because I do know a little bit more about at least the forest in photo number 1, is that this forest is actually a palm tree plantation. So this is in Central America where they have cut down the natural forest that looks like this, and they have planted palm trees so that they can harvest palm oil, which is used in lots of different products. And so in this forest, we now have a one tree species diversity, which is very low. We saw what happened in our low biodiversity fir only forest in our biodiversity example. And so if anything were to happen that can influence palm trees or can hurt palm trees, this forest is very susceptible to change. But in photo number 2, this is what this forest used to look like before it was cut down and turned into a palm oil plantation. And this forest has really high biodiversity. Central and South American rainforests actually have the highest biodiversity in the whole world. So that's just some context that I know that I personally have for these two photos. So I would say that photo number 2 shows a healthier forest than photo number 1. Okay, here's our final question. Which forest do you think is healthier based on these photos? Do you think it's photo number 1 or photo number 2? Again, I will start my 30-second timer so that you can take a closer look and make some observations. So our 30 seconds is up. And for these two photos, I want to go through all 4 of our factors of forest health and make some observations before we try and determine which forest is healthier. The first one is that the majority of trees and plants are alive. And in photo number 1, it's a little bit hard to determine this because of the angle that the photo was taken. So we can't see too many of the trees in this forest, although we can definitely see some dead trees. So we see that this tree right here has been cut off or broken in some way. I don't know in what manner it died, but we can definitely tell that this is a dead tree. And we can see that there are some branches here on the side that are brown or missing its needles, which is an indicator of another dead tree. We do see a couple of trees that could potentially be alive or dead. It's a little bit harder to tell. So I don't think that this is the best factor to try and make an argument about for at least photo number 1. In photo number 2, I would say that the majority of trees are alive. We can see, at least in the background, that there's lots of green on the branches, which means that the needles and leaves are still photosynthesizing. The trees in the foreground are a little bit harder to tell because we can't actually see those branches just because they're little bits. I'm making the assumption that the branches are probably higher up on these trees so we can't see them. So I can make the assumption that the majority of trees and plants are not alive in photo number 1 and that the majority of trees and plants are alive in photo number 2, but it's not the strongest evidence for which one is healthier. So we're going to move on to our next factor of forest health, which is diversity of age groups. And I think that both of these photos show similar diversity of age groups in the fact that we really only see mature trees, except for we do see some dead trees. So photo number 1, we see 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 mature trees and at least 2 dead trees. So not the best diversity of age groups. And in photo number 2, we also mostly see mature trees. Since I don't know the exact type of trees that are being shown in photo number 2, I can't say for sure that some of these skinnier trees are saplings or mature trees. They could be either, but it's kind of hard to tell based on this photo. So it seems like their age diversities are slightly similar. So we're going to move on to our third factor of a healthy forest, which is that there are other types of life present in the forest. And photo number 1 makes it pretty obvious that there are definitely other types of life present because of the presence of a coyote. So if there's a coyote in this forest, that means that there has to be other types of smaller animals for it to feed on. We can also see in the background that there are some shrubs or some bushes. So there's other type of plant life as well. Whereas in photo number 2, this forest looks a little bit more bare. We don't really see any shrubs, although the forest floor is covered in what I'm assuming is moss, which is what all of the green stuff is. So maybe a lower diversity of other types of life found in the forest, but there are still some. But I would say based on that factor, that photo number 1 shows more types of life. And then our last factor of forest health is biodiversity, so different types of tree species. In photo number 1, I can very clearly see that there is a cedar tree here in the background based on the bark. And then based on these branches, it looks like there are fir trees. So we can see at least 2 different types of trees found in this forest. In photo number 2, it's a little bit harder to identify these trees. I would say that there is at least pine and fir found in the forest. But the rest are not trees that I personally know how to identify, but they do have different looks. So some of them are a lot skinnier than others, some have different texture on the bark. So this could also be an indicator of high biodiversity, that there's other types, or that there's multiple types of trees found in this forest. So overall, I don't think that there is one clear answer for this. I think that there are a variety of factors that show both healthy and unhealthy things happening in these forests. So photo number 1, this forest can obviously sustain other types of life, the presence of a coyote and shrubs in the background, but we also see a lot of dead trees and vegetation on the ground that could make it more susceptible to severe wildfires. Whereas in photo number 2, we see a fairly dense forest, so there's lots of trees, potentially high biodiversity of trees, but not a whole lot of other types of life. So the main takeaway from this one is that there's a lot of different factors to consider, and there isn't always one right answer, but I would love to know your thoughts. Maybe you came up with a different observation than what I came up with, and you can put those in the comments of this video if you want to share with us what you think about which photo shows a healthier forest. So before we get into my nature walk, I just want to really briefly go over 2 resources for you so that when you do your nature walk, you have some assistance with tree identification, because I don't expect that you're all going to be absolute pros and have all of this memory just ready to pull out of your brain once you get out into the forest, because I know that I'm giving you a lot of information right now. So 2 resources that we're providing to you are the SWEP tree key and the student tree ID sheet. Both of these are linked on the PDF that we are providing for this field trip. The student tree ID sheet is just a document that basically summarizes the first about 20 minutes of this field trip, where we talked about the identifying features of trees in Tahoe. So that'll tell you that the sugar pine has 5 needles and a big cone, or that a white fir has wide needles and is found at lower elevations. That's what that tree key, or that's what the tree ID sheet is there for, you know. This right here is the SWEP tree key, and SWEP is the Sierra Watershed Education Partnerships. They are another environmental education agency in North Lake Tahoe, and if you haven't had a field trip with them before, I'd highly recommend checking them out. They are awesome, and they created this tree key to go along with one of their SWEP snippets, because they also want to teach people how to identify trees in Tahoe's forests. So we are using their tree key because it's a really awesome resource, and I am quickly going to go through how to use this tree key. So the way that this works is that it asks you one question at a time and you get two answers and you pick one or the other. So it's a this or that answer. And then you keep on following your way along the tree key until you get to the tree that you're trying to identify. So for example, if in this photo I am this person and I am standing in the forest, I'm looking up at these trees and I want to identify it, but I don't totally know where to start, I would pull out this tree key. You can print at home or you can write it down on a piece of paper like I would have to because I don't have a printer. And we would start at the top. So I have here highlighted in red the first question. So is this tree an evergreen or a deciduous tree? And we can tell from this photo that it is an evergreen. It has the classic evergreen look and it's got its needles. So we know that this is an evergreen, so we're going to highlight that. And then we're going to follow the arrows down from evergreen. So we're going to ignore everything that's on this deciduous side because we know it's not a deciduous tree. So our next question is, are the leaves attached individually or are they attached in bundles? So this is going to tell us whether or not it's a pine or a fir or a cedar. So if we're looking at this photo, it can be kind of hard to tell in the photo. It'll be easier to tell in person because you can actually pluck the needles off the branch and see if they come off in a bundle or individually. And if they came off individually, they would look more like these photos down here where the needles are attached right on the branch. But I know that these needles in this photo are attached in bundles. You can kind of see there's two needles there that go down, and then they're attached to the branch as a bundle. So then we're going to follow the next arrow that is under the bundles. And that's asking, are the needles in the bundle attached in 2, 3, or 5? And again, it's harder to see in the photo. It'll be a lot easier to see when you're in person. You can either reach up on the tree and pluck the needles off, or if the tree is too tall and the needles are too high above your head, you can look on the ground near the base of the tree. There will most likely be needles that have fallen off. You can pick those up, make sure that you're looking at the needles in your hand and then at the tree to make sure that they match. If you're holding up needles that are really, really short and you see that the tree has a bundle like this or a branch like this, that they probably didn't fall from this tree, so make sure that they look the same, and then you can actually count the number of needles. So I know that this right here is representing a branch that has needles in bundles of 3. Then you go to the next question. Are the pine cones pokey or are they gentle? And so you have to pick it up and either determine by feel or by look. So are the spines on the end of the pine cones, are they facing out, making it pokey and painful when you pick it up? Or are they facing in and it is a gentle cone? And so I know that these spines are facing out and that this is a pokey pine cone, which makes it a ponderosa pine tree. So this is a good resource when you're still learning how to identify trees to take out in the forest with you. If you practice enough, you won't even need the tree key. You'll just be able to remember all of the identifying features that go with the trees. But that definitely comes with a bit of practice. Okay, so it is time for our nature walk. I am actually going to head out into the forest across the street from my house, and I am going to collect some data on forest biodiversity by identifying the different trees that I see on my walk, and also on age diversity by trying to classify what age group each of those trees fall into. And once I come back inside from that, we're going to look at our data together and try and determine if Tahoe's forests are healthy. And when I go outside to collect data on biodiversity, even though we did talk about the different types of pines and firs that are in our forest, I'm only going to be writing down whether the tree is a pine, fir, cedar, or an aspen. I'm not going to write down if it's a ponderosa pine, a Jeffrey pine, a sugar pine, or a lodgepole pine. That's really great information to know. And when you go out on your nature walk, feel free to collect that data because you can use it to further the discussion on biodiversity in our forests, but we're not going to do that in our discussion in this field trip. So I'm going to head out into the forest and you can follow me on my nature walk. What I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the path here and I'm just going to identify all of the trees that I see along the side of the path for about 10 to 15 minutes. and I'm going to collect a little bit of data so that we can analyze later whether or not this forest is healthy. So the data that I will be collecting is on the 4 common trees. So we are going to be looking for pine, fir, cedar, and aspen trees, and we'll also be looking at their age class. So I'll determine if it's a seedling, sapling, mature tree, or a dead tree. And along the way, if I see that it is a ponderosa pine, or sugar pine, a lodgepole pine, or Jeffrey pine, I will let you know how I know that, but we are not going to be collecting data on that today. So let's go on a nature walk. So we're going to start with the 3 trees that are behind me right here. We're going to start first with this tree. So if we take a look up, we can see that this is an evergreen tree. And we know that it is an evergreen tree because it is currently December and it has all of its needles still. And if it was a deciduous tree, the needles would have been fallen off and this would be very bare. So we know it's an evergreen tree, and now we have to determine whether or not the needles are attached in bundles or individually. And since it's pretty tall and I can't reach the needles above me, I'm going to pick up some needles at the base of the tree. And I'm going to check and make sure that they look the same as the needles that are on the tree above. And they do. And I see that when I pick up these needles, they come in a bundle. So they are not attached individually. So I know that this is a pine tree. So I'm just going to mark on my data sheet that it's a pine. And these needles are attached in 3. See if I can hold those up. So we know that this is either a ponderosa pine tree or a Jeffrey pine tree. And the way to determine that is by looking at the bark or their pine cones. So there is a pine cone right here. And I know that this is a Jeffrey pine cone because the spines on the pine cone face in. So these are the pokey parts are called spines, and if they were facing out, it would be a prickly ponderosa cone, but they're facing in, so it is a gentle Jeffrey. So we know that this is a ponderosa tree, and we also know that this ponderosa pine is a mature tree. So mature is its age class, and we know that because it is very, very tall and it does not have flexible bark, so that's how you determine whether or not it is a sapling or mature. So I'm going to write down that we have a mature tree. And we're going to move on to this next. We have 2 trees over here. So this first one, it is short enough that I can actually take the pine needles right off of it, so we can determine right away what kind of a tree it is. We see that they come off in bundles, not individually, so we know that this is a pine tree. So I'm going to mark that on my data sheet. And this pine tree also has needles in bundle of 3, so again it is a ponderosa pine or a Jeffrey pine, but it's really hard to determine what type of a pine tree it is right now because this is actually a sapling. So it hasn't developed any cones yet. That is what a mature tree would do, and it is taller than 3 feet tall, so we know it's not a seedling. Since we know it's a sapling, I'm going to mark that on our data sheet, and we'll look at this next tree. This one is just a little bit too tall for me able to pull off needles from it, so I'm going to have to take them from the ground. And I need to make sure that they look similar to the needles above me, and they do. And again, these come off in a bundle. They're not individually attached, so we know it's a pine tree. And this pine tree does not have flexible bark. If I push on the tree, it's not going to go anywhere. So I'm going to mark on my data sheet that we have a mature tree, and we'll continue on. So we've got our next 2 trees that we're going to identify here. So I'll start with this really, really big tree right here, and if I look up, I know what kind of needles I should be looking for, but I can't reach them, so I have to take them off the ground. I want to make sure they look the same, and they do. And so this is another pine tree because the needles came in a bundle. So I'm going to mark on my data sheet that it is a pine. So we know that this pine tree is either a ponderosa pine or a Jeffrey pine because the needles come in a bundle of 3. And so the next way we can determine whether or not it's a Jeffrey or a ponderosa is either look for the pine cones or to look at the bark. And so The bark actually produces a really sweet smell when it's a Jeffrey pine, and this tree smells pretty good. So I know it's a Jeffrey, but we are not collecting data on that. We're just collecting that it is a pine tree. And we know that this pine tree right here is a mature tree because it is very large. If I were to push on this tree's not going anywhere. So I'm going to mark down that it is mature. And we'll continue over here. So this tree right here is another evergreen, and since its leaves are really low, I can break some off. And I will show you what they look like. So, these leaves are very flat, and they are scaly and segmented, so they have individual parts that I can break off. And this is a telltale sign that this is a cedar tree. So I'm going to mark that on our data sheet. There's one other tree that we don't talk about in our Trees of Tahoe field trip, but that is a Sierra juniper. And junipers actually look very similar to cedars, except for their leaves are a lot pokier when you touch them, and they are not flat, they're more rounded. So if you see that they're flat and you can move your fingers along them without being poked, you know it's a cedar tree. And we know that this cedar tree is a sapling, it's not mature, and one of the main ways that you can tell is that the bark here is actually, it looks like it's flaking off. It doesn't have the distinguished mature bark of a cedar tree, which is that really red color that runs in vertical strips. And if I were to push on it, the whole tree kind of jiggles, and that's because it still has flexible bark. So I'm going to mark that we have a sapling, and we'll continue on our nature walk. So these are the next two trees we are going to identify. So we have this evergreen right here. We know that it is an evergreen because it still has all of its leaves, even though it is winter. And so I am going to grab some needles off of the ground, and I'm going to double check that they look like the needles that are on this tree, and they do. And they come together in a bundle. So we know that this is a pine tree. Mark that on the data sheet. And so right here we have a fir tree, and so we can see on the fir that these needles are attached directly to the branch right here. So if I just break off one needle, we see that it comes off individually, whereas the pine needles, they come off in a bundle. So they are attached to the branch as a bundle, whereas the fir needles are attached directly to the branch individually. So I can write down that we have a fir. And so we know that this tree right here is a mature pine tree. If I push on it, this tree is not going anywhere. And I can tell you what type of pine it is by looking at the pine cones. And so these spines, see if I can show this to you, the spines on the end of the pieces of the pine cone, they stick out. So this is a prickly ponderosa cone. So this is a ponderosa pine tree. And so I'm going to mark on my data sheet that we have one mature tree. And we know that this fir right here is a seedling. And we know that it's a seedling because it's really tiny and it's less than 3 feet tall. So once it gets taller than 3 feet, it becomes a sapling. So I'll write down that we have a seedling, and we'll continue on. So we've got some interesting trees behind me right here. We have a smaller tree nestled underneath a large cedar that looks like it's falling over, but it continues growing right past this other large pine tree. So let's investigate and figure out exactly what type of trees all of these are and why we know that. We can start with the small one because I can actually see all of its needles, and so if we look close, we can see that all of the needles here are attached directly to the branch. So if we pull it off, it comes off individually. So we know that this is a fir tree, so I'll mark that on my data sheet. And we know that this is a sapling, not a mature tree, because all of the needles are sticking straight up, and that tells you that this is a white fir sapling. So I'll record that. So now that we know that this is a fir tree, I will tell you why I know that this is an incense cedar over here. So If we look up, you can see very distinct strips of bark that go up towards the tree. And this is a telltale sign that we have a cedar right here. No pine or fir tree has similar bark, so we can write down that we have a cedar. And we also know that this cedar is a mature tree because it is absolutely massive. There is no way that I could push on that and it would have flexible bark, despite the fact that it is bending right over on top of the next tree that we're going to identify. So let's go see what this last tree is. Oh, this right here, we can see that it is an evergreen tree. It's still got all of its needles, but the needles are too high for me to pick off the tree. So I'm gonna look at the ground, and this right here looks like it came from the same tree. They're a lot shorter needles than other pine trees. And so if we pluck off some needles, I'll put this on the ground. We can see that they come in a bundle, so we know it's a pine tree. So I will mark on my data sheet that we've got a pine. And if we look at them, this pine tree has needles in bundles of 5. So we know that this pine tree is actually a sugar pine. And the way that I remember that is that there are 5 letters in the word sugar, and there are 5 needles in a sugar pine bundle of needles. And I will see if my lovely videographer can get some shots of the giant pine cones that will be hanging off, because sugar pines have the largest pine cones of any pine tree here in Lake Tahoe. So we can see these giant pine cones hanging off the top of our sugar pine tree. We also know that this is a mature pine tree because there are cones hanging off the top, and that is the way that trees reproduce. And so that is one of the signs that we have a mature tree. So here we have another evergreen tree, so it still has all of its green needles, even though it's really cold outside. And I am going to just take a few off, and I will come show them to you. So we know that it is a fir because we can see that all of the needles are attached directly to the branch there. So when I pick one off, it comes off individually, it does not come off in a bundle. And we know that this is a white fir, not a red fir, because all of the needles are very wide. They go out to the sides from the branch, whereas the red fir, they kind of stick up and down and they go all the way around. So remember, wide for white fir. I'll mark that on my data sheet. And we know that this fir tree right here, this one can be a little bit more complicated to determine the age class because it could be anywhere between a mature tree and a sapling. So I'm going to push on the bark. And it gives a little bit of a wiggle, so I am going to write down on our data sheet that this is a sapling. And now we'll continue on. So we have another evergreen tree right here, and this is another fir. So if I pluck off a needle, it comes off individually, it does not come in a bundle, and so I am going to record that we have a fir tree. And another way that you can determine whether or not a fir is a red fir or a white fir is just based off of where you're seeing the fir. So I know that right now I'm pretty close to lake level, so more likely than not this is going to be a white fir, because white fir are found at lake level and red fir are almost always found at higher elevations. So we know that this is a white fir, and we can also tell because the needles on it are out to the side, so they're very wide, they're not round. And we know that this fir tree right here is either a sapling or a mature tree, and I'm going to push on the bark and see if it's flexible. This one doesn't really go anywhere, so I'm going to write down that this is a mature tree. So this is the last tree that I am going to identify because we've been out here for about 10 to 15 minutes now. So I'm going to head back inside and we are going to analyze this data and see if we can answer the question, are Tahoe's forests healthy? Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed my nature walk. And I've already put in all of the data that I collected out there straight from my data sheet into the presentation in the following graphs. So we can go right on in looking at our data and having a discussion about what we think this data represents. So we can see here that during my nature walk, we found 1 seedling, 4 saplings, 7 mature trees, 0 dead trees. And then for types of trees, there were 0 aspen, 6 pine, 4 fir, and 2 cedar trees. And we are going to be talking about the data that I collected throughout the next probably 15 to 20 minutes. So if you want to have this data on hand, you can take a second to pause the video and write this down so that you can reference it when I ask you certain discussion questions. I will give you the graphs for every question that I ask, but just in case you want to have this down in your notes, I know that that can be helpful for me. Otherwise, I'm going to move on. Okay, so based on the data that we collected, I created this graph that shows us the forest biodiversity based on the survey that I just did. So as we saw from our data, there were no aspen trees, but there were 6 pine trees, 4 fir trees, and 2 cedar trees. And even though during my nature walk, I pointed out how to determine what type of pine trees or what type of fir trees they were, we were not recording data on the specific types of pine and fir. We were just looking at our 4 main types of trees. And if you want to write down this graph in your notes, you can feel free to pause the video and just resume once you're done. I will be providing you the graphs with the discussion questions. So you don't need to do it, but it is something that I find to be helpful. And then we have our age diversity graph. So we have our 4 age classes on our x-axis and the number of trees on the y-axis. So we found 1 seedling, 4 saplings, 7 mature trees, and we didn't see any dead trees. So again, if you want to copy down this graph, just pause the video and resume when you're ready. Otherwise, we'll move right into our discussion questions. So for each question, I will show you the graph that goes along with it, and I want you to pause the video for about 5 minutes and have a discussion with whoever you are doing this field trip with. And if you're by yourself, I just want you to write down some notes as to what you think the answer is. So our first question, do you think forest biodiversity is high or low? So here's our forest biodiversity graph. So you can pause the video now for about 5 minutes and discuss what you think the data shows about forest biodiversity. Okay, so do you think forest biodiversity is high or low? I think that forest biodiversity is high based off this graph here. So we found 3 out of 4 of our most common trees in Tahoe. So we found pine, fir, and cedar. If we had only found 2 of our 4 types of trees, that's where this gets a little bit tricky because that could represent high or low. It's right on the cusp. If we were only to have found 1 type of tree, then it would be definitive, this is low biodiversity. Um, but since we were able to find 3 types, we can say that the forest biodiversity in this section of the forest that I surveyed is high. So moving on to our second discussion question, do you think age diversity is high or low? So here is our graph for age diversity, and I want you to pause the video here for about 5 minutes and discuss or write down, do you think age diversity is high or low, and why do you think that? So do you think age diversity is high or low? This actually looks fairly similar to our forest biodiversity graph where we have 3 out of the 4 that we were able to find. So I would say yes, our age diversity is high. We didn't see too many seedlings and we didn't see any dead trees. It's a little bit on the lower end of that high diversity, but since we were able to see 3 out of the 4, I would still say that it's high. Again, if we were only to see 2 of our age classes, that's when it kind of gets a little bit trickier. And if we were only to have seen 1 age class, then we would say that our age diversity is low. So the answer to this question is our age diversity is high. What can we conclude about forest health based on the data we just collected? So again, pause the video for about 5 minutes and discuss or write down if you're by yourself what you can conclude about forest health based on the data we just collected and the conversations we just had in our last two discussion questions. So what can we conclude about forest health based on the data we just collected? So we determined in our last two discussion questions that forest biodiversity is considered high and that age diversity is considered high. And if we think back to our discussion earlier about the factors of forest health, hopefully you remember me saying that it is important to have high forest biodiversity, and it is also important to have higher age diversity. So these are both indicators that we have a healthy forest. And that's based on the data that we just collected during my nature walk. So our final discussion question, can we make conclusions about Tahoe's forests based on this area we surveyed? So again, provide you the two graphs, and I want you to pause the video for 5 minutes and discuss or write down, can we make conclusions about Tahoe's forests based on this area we surveyed? So can we make conclusions about Tahoe's forests based on the area we surveyed? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Since I only surveyed one very small section of the forest surrounding Lake Tahoe, it's not the most representative sample of all of the forests. So for example, I could have walked through the one section of forest that had cedar and fir, and the rest of the forest could just have pine, but we wouldn't know because we found fir and cedar in our sample. The same goes for age diversity. I could have walked through the one section of the forest that actually had seedlings and saplings, and for some reason the rest of the forest might not. The most accurate way to conclude whether or not Tahoe's forests are healthy is to do this survey multiple times in different areas of the forest. So the more that you do this, the more confident that you can be in your data for representing Tahoe's forests as a whole. So I did this nature walk as an example to show you how you can go out and do your own. And I actually have a post activity created for you all to do this at home with your friends or family. So the next time you go on a hike or just a walk in the woods, you can either print out my data sheets that I will provide to you, or you can just write them down on a piece of paper the way that I did because I don't have a printer. And then after you collect your data, you can come home and graph it out just like this and try and draw your own conclusions on whether or not forest biodiversity is high, age diversity is high, and what that says about the forest health in the areas that you surveyed. Um, and if you're doing this as a class, then you can take all of the data that everybody collected and put it together in one final graph showing the forest biodiversity of all of the areas that your class surveyed and the age diversity from all the areas that your class surveyed, so that you can confidently draw conclusions about the health of Tahoe's forests. So the final question that I have for you watching this video is, are Tahoe's forests healthy? I am going to set a 30-second timer, and I want you to discuss with whoever is participating in this field trip with you, or you can just write down your answer. Are Tahoe's forests healthy? Okay, so if that wasn't enough time and you still want to think about it, pause the video until you're ready. So the answer to are Tahoe's forests healthy is it is complicated. There are a lot of factors to consider, like we talked about, and in order to collect data and really determine if Tahoe's forests are healthy, you need to do multiple different surveys around the lake. So hopefully this video has inspired you to go out and do your own surveys in a few different areas and see how they compare. So Before we get into the post activities that I've created to go along with this virtual field trip, I'm going to hand this over to Allison, one of my coworkers, and she is going to just very briefly talk about what the researchers at UC Davis Turk are doing to help make Tahoe's forests more resilient.
So the UC Davis Forest and Ecology Lab uses ecological and genetic approaches to promote forest health and resiliency. So they're looking at things like plant traits, as well as the influence of the surrounding environment and the resulting evolutionary processes. So what does that all mean? To really set this up, you need to think about how we get our characteristics. In the same way that you may have inherited your mom's green eyes, or perhaps you've inherited your dad's tall stature, his height. Plants can also pass on traits similar to their progeny or their baby trees. So we are targeting trees that display these adaptive traits that are necessary for survival in hopes that our selected trees are better able to withstand the many challenges of our currently changing climate and the related impacts. And this is just one solution to confront the large loss of sugar pines. We reforest stands with trees specifically selected due to their proven resilience against bark beetle outbreaks. So basically, in a stand of dead trees, we're looking for the ones that are still standing. We're looking for the survivors. So, September 2017, Turk's Forest and Ecology Lab collected from a diverse seed source across the north shore of Lake Tahoe. And these seeds were germinated, and some seedlings were planted in the basin, and others currently reside in our lath house in the Tahoe City Field Station, where they are being monitored and evaluated for their selected plant traits. The thousands of seedlings that were planted around the Tahoe Basin will theoretically promote forest resiliency because these baby trees are the progeny of drought survivors and are more likely to persist in our changing and uncertain climate. Darwin's theory summarizes it best. Everybody's heard of survival of the fittest. In this case, the strongest trees have survived, and the key to their survival is in their genes. So thanks so much for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you around the healthy forests.
Thanks, Allison. I hope that helps summarize what it is that our UC Davis Turk researchers are doing in our Tahoe forests. So after the drought, they went out there and they collected seeds from the drought surviving trees. They do this after wildfires, and they make sure to get trees that have survived all of those stressors that we talked about earlier when we were talking about factors of forest health. And they have targeted those trees so that they can grab those seeds and plant the seedlings around the Tahoe Basin. So hopefully in the future, we'll have a forest of very strong trees that were able to overcome a lot of those stressors, making them more resilient to change to our Tahoe forests. So thank you all for participating in this field trip with me. I just have two more quick things to go over. So if you want to practice your new tree identifying skills, I have two post activities that I have created to help you do that. So the first one is a really fun game that I made that's a combination of a scavenger hunt and bingo. So you can take the bingo cards. There's 4 different cards, so you can play against 3 other people. So you can take these out on your next hike and practice your tree identifying skills by finding some of the trees that we talked about. So ponderosa pine, or looking for a sugar pine cone. You can also practice looking for different age groups, so seedlings, fallen trees, saplings. All of the terminology that's on the bingo card are things that we've discussed during this field trip, and you can challenge your friends or family to practice their tree identification and forest health assessment skills with you. And then the second post activity I created is a worksheet to help you assess the health of the forest in your backyard or your neighborhood. So it's just a worksheet that will take you through the steps that we went through during this field trip for my nature walk, the data collection, and discussion. So it takes you step by step through so that you on your own or with your friends and family can assess your forest health And I would highly recommend doing this multiple times in a couple different forests so that you can be more confident when answering the question, are Tahoe's forests healthy? So again, thank you for participating. If you have any questions at all, this video is always going to be there for you on YouTube, or you can also send me an email at bngoodwin@ucdavis.edu, and I will do my best to reply back to you quickly with any questions that you have. So thanks for participating.